What if I told you there was once a king, so deformed, so frail, and so plagued by whispers of dark magic that his own people believed he was cursed by the devil himself? They called him El Hechizedo the Bewitched. His reign was not a fairy tale of crowns and gold, but a slow-motion tragedy, a living testament to the corruption of power and the decay of a bloodline obsessed with keeping its grip on the throne. And when his autopsy finally revealed horrors beyond imagination, it was as if the nightmares of an entire kingdom had been confirmed. This is the story of Charles II of Spain, the king born to rule an empire yet barely able to rule himself. If you dare to uncover the truth behind this most cursed of monarchs, hit that subscribe button, because we're only just beginning. The streets of Madrid in the late 17th century were filled with rumor. Market sellers whispered it over bread stalls, servants muttered it while scrubbing stone floors, and even noble courtiers dressed in their silks lowered their voices when the topic came up. The king was not like other men. They said his eyes were dull as stagnant water, that his jaw hung slack, and that he moved with the stiff, uncertain steps of a marionette. Some believed witchcraft was to blame. Others swore that his deformities were God's punishment for the sins of his ancestors. Few dared to speak aloud the most dangerous truth of all, that the real curse was the bloodline itself. Charles II was born on November 6, 1661, the long-awaited heir to the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. His birth should have been a moment of national triumph, but even in the cradle there was an unease that crept through the royal court. He was small, far too small and frail, his head unusually large for his body. His tongue was so oversized that it made speaking and swallowing difficult, and his jaw jutted forward in that infamous Habsburg profile, the product of generations of inbreeding. Midwives crossed themselves. Priests muttered prayers over his crib. The child was alive, but already some wondered if that was a blessing or a curse. To understand Charles's condition, one must understand the obsession of the Habsburgs. For over 2 centuries, they had ruled vast swaths of Europe, Spain, Austria, the Low Countries, and far beyond. And they guarded their power with one ruthless strategy: they married only within their own bloodline. Cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, aunt to nephew. Marriage was not about love, it was about keeping territory and power consolidated. But this came at a cost, one paid most heavily by Charles II. His very body was the final ledger of centuries of genetic debt. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was both his mother and his cousin. His father, Philip IV, was both his father and his uncle. This tangled family tree left Charles with an inbreeding coefficient so high that it was as if his parents were siblings. The result was a boy whose immune system was weak, whose bones were brittle, and whose development lagged far behind other children. At an age when most boys ran in palace courtyards, Charles could barely walk without help. By his teens, it was clear he would never be the strong ruler his empire so desperately needed. But in the world of absolute monarchy, appearance mattered almost as much as strength. The court painters did their best to flatter him, softening the jut of his jaw, brightening the dullness of his eyes. But even the most skilled brush could not erase reality. In private, servants described his skin as waxy and sallow, his hair thin and brittle. He spoke slowly, struggled with chewing, and was prone to long periods of illness that left him bedridden. Yet, despite his fragility, he was still the king, and the kingdom's survival depended on him producing an heir. From the moment he reached marriageable age, Charles's life became a desperate game of diplomacy and medicine. Royal physicians concocted strange tonics and whispered of ancient remedies to strengthen his virility. Diplomats scoured Europe for brides seeking alliances as much as fertility. His first marriage to Marie-Louise of Orléans was celebrated with pomp and ceremony, But behind the closed doors of the palace, the truth was grim. The young queen, vibrant and healthy, found herself bound to a husband who could barely touch her without pain. The pressure on Marie-Louise was suffocating. Each month without a pregnancy brought her more hostility from the court, more whispered accusations. She starved herself from stress, and her health began to collapse. After 10 years of a childless and loveless union, she died suddenly at just 26. Officially, it was declared natural causes, but the servants spoke of poison of a slow, deliberate removal by those who feared she might be an obstacle to a second, more fruitful marriage for the king. Charles's second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, entered the marriage fully aware of the whispers that surrounded her new husband. She was shrewd, politically astute, and determined to survive in a court as venomous as any battlefield. But no amount of cunning could change the reality of Charles's condition. Their marriage, like the first, produced no children. The royal bloodline, once so fiercely guarded, was now on the brink of extinction, a fact that plunged the kingdom into political chaos. As the years wore on, Charles's health grew worse. He suffered from seizures, intestinal disorders, and chronic infections. He could no longer chew solid food, his body wasting away as if consumed from within. Rumors of curses returned now louder than ever. Priests were summoned to perform exorcisms in the royal bedchamber. The people of Spain, half in fear and half in superstition, began to believe their king was not merely sick, he was bewitched. What none of them realized was that the true horror was far more tangible, written in the very DNA of the man they served. The Spanish court became a theater of shadows, where superstition and politics fed off each other. Every unexplained illness, every night of fever and delirium was taken as proof of dark forces at work. The Queen accused Charles' enemies of witchcraft. His enemies accused the Queen of the same. Physicians dosed him with mercury arsenic and herbal brews that did more harm than good. His chambers were thick with the scent of incense candles burning at all hours and the soft murmur of prayers. Yet the king only grew weaker. In the midst of this decline, foreign ambassadors began circling like vultures. The Habsburg Empire was vast, its wealth immense, and the absence of an heir meant its spoils were there for the taking. France, Austria, and other European powers schemed in the background, each ready to claim a piece of the dying giant. Charles himself was painfully aware of his role in this high-stakes game. He was both king and bargaining chip, a man whose very survival determined the balance of power on the continent. Desperate for a cure, Charles's advisors turned to the church. In 1698, a Dominican friar conducted what was described as a spiritual diagnosis. The friar declared that the king had been cursed at birth through witchcraft, that his ailments were not of natural origin. The prescription, exorcism. What followed blurred the line between medicine and ritual, a series of public prayers, the laying on of relics, and the repeated sprinkling of holy water over the frail monarch. None of it brought relief. The people's belief in the supernatural explanation only deepened when Charles's appearance worsened. His skin took on a yellowish hue. His eyes sank deeper into their sockets. His hands trembled constantly, and his speech was slurred. Court chroniclers recorded that his legs could barely support him, and he often had to be carried to council meetings. Still, he clung to his duties, signing decrees and receiving ambassadors, a ghostly figure draped in royal robes. Whispers grew louder that Charles was not merely unlucky, but actively cursed by God for the sins of his ancestors. The Habsburgs, after all, had waged brutal wars, suppressed revolts, and imposed the Inquisition. Now, some claimed divine retribution had taken the form of a broken king whose body could not produce an heir. This idea took root in a deeply religious society, giving the king's illness a moral and apocalyptic dimension. But the truth, for those willing to see it, was not divine at all. It was human, painfully, tragically human. The Habsburgs' obsessive inbreeding had created a genetic trap. Scientists centuries later would analyze their family tree and find an inbreeding coefficient so extreme that it was as if the family had been breeding within a closed loop for generations. This had led to the Habsburg jaw, the weak immune systems, and the infertility that plagued Charles and others before him. By the year 1700, Charles was barely functioning. His body was ravaged by years of illness and misguided treatments. His abdomen was swollen, his limbs thin, his skin pale as parchment. He was only 38 years old, but looked decades older. His council debated whether he could even survive the year. Behind the palace walls, Maria Anna, his wife, maneuvered politically to secure her own position for the inevitable moment when Charles would die without an heir. That moment came on November 1st, 1700. The court plunged into mourning, though for many, grief was mixed with grim anticipation. The king's death marked not just the end of a reign, but the end of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. Bells tolled across Madrid, black drapes hung from the palace windows, and funeral processions wound through the streets. The people whispered prayers for his soul, but also feared what would come next, the struggle for the empire he left behind. It was in the aftermath of his death that the most disturbing revelations emerged. An autopsy was ordered partly to understand his mysterious illnesses, partly to silence the rumors of witchcraft. The findings were so shocking that they spread far beyond Spain. His body was emaciated, but his abdomen was filled with fluid. His heart was abnormally small, blackened as if burned. His intestines were gangrenous and his lungs corroded. His head was filled with excess fluid, and his reproductive organs were described as extremely atrophied. The physician who conducted the autopsy concluded that it was a miracle Charles had lived as long as he did. To the superstitious, these findings confirmed the curse. To the rational, they were proof of something far more damning, that power, when hoarded and inbred for too long, can destroy the very line it was meant to protect. Charles II had been both king and victim ruler, and prisoner of a dynasty that chose its own supremacy over the health of its blood. News of the autopsy spread through Europe like wildfire. In the courts of Paris, Vienna, and London, nobles shook their heads in a mix of pity and satisfaction. For Charles's enemies, the grotesque details were a vindication of their whispers. The once mighty Spanish Habsburgs had rotted from within. In taverns and marketplaces, ordinary people repeated the findings with morbid fascination, blending fact with superstition until the story became legend, the king who was too weak to live, yet too stubborn to die. But for Spain, this was not a tale to amuse foreign courts, it was a national catastrophe. The death of Charles II without an heir plunged the country into the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict that would last over a decade and reshape the map of Europe. Armies marched across the continent not for ideology or faith, but for the spoils of a dead man's crown. The Spanish people, exhausted by decades of misrule, now faced famine taxes and foreign occupation. In hindsight, historians would see Charles as more than just an unfortunate monarch. He was a symbol, the embodiment of a dynasty's fatal flaw. His story became a warning, whispered among royal courts, that the quest to preserve purity of blood could lead not to strength but to extinction. Yet, in his own time, Charles was not seen as a lesson. He was seen as a curse that needed lifting even after death. Months after his burial, strange rumors surfaced that his tomb had been disturbed. Some claimed priests returned to perform rites to release his soul from enchantment. Others swore the body had been exhumed to search for signs of witchcraft, talismans, charms, or marks on the skin. Whether true or not, these tales reflected the desperation of a nation that could not accept the real, banal truth: their downfall was man-made. The legend of El Hechizado grew with each retelling. In rural Spain, grandmothers would warn children to avoid marrying too close in the family, lest they bear the curse of the bewitched king. In the palaces of Europe, Charles's portrait became a quiet embarrassment for the Habsburg line, often tucked away in shadowed galleries. But for scholars, centuries later, his face was a map, every angle of his jaw, every droop of his eyelid, telling the story of a lineage that had trapped itself. Science would eventually strip the story of its supernatural trappings. Geneticists examining the Habsburg family tree discovered the staggering extent of inbreeding so concentrated that genetic disorders were inevitable. The distinctive protruding jaw was just the most visible sign. Infertility, immune deficiencies, and mental impairments were the hidden costs. Charles's condition, once blamed on demons, was instead the ultimate proof of biological inevitability. Yet the truth, though clearer, was no less haunting. It revealed a different kind of curse, one of human arrogance. The Habsburgs had believed they could defy nature itself, bending bloodlines to their will. For a time, it had worked. They commanded empires, shaped history, and married their way to dominance. But nature collects its debts, and Charles II was the final payment. In the dim halls of the Escorial Monastery, where Charles was laid to rest, the air is thick with the weight of centuries. Visitors pass his tomb without knowing the full measure of the man inside, not the king in his robes, but the boy in the cradle, born already marked by the ambitions of his ancestors. Here lies a monarch who ruled half the world on paper, but never truly ruled himself. The Spanish Habsburg line ended with him replaced by the Bourbon dynasty from France. The shift brought its own political storms, but it also marked the close of a chapter written in generations of self-inflicted decline. Charles' story faded from the forefront of politics, but it lingered as a dark footnote in the history of kings, a reminder that power, when preserved at any cost, can become the instrument of its own undoing. Even now, the life of Charles II captivates those who stumble upon it. Not because he was a great ruler, he was not. Not because he was a villain, he wasn't that either. But because he was a living paradox, the most powerful man in Spain, yet powerless over his own fate. His life was a cautionary tale wrapped in superstition, tragedy, and the quiet horror of inevitability. And it all began with the choice, centuries before his birth, to put blood above all else. The early years of Charles's reign were marked not by decisive leadership, but by regencies and advisors pulling the strings. His mother, Mariana of Austria, served as regent for much of his youth, clinging fiercely to power. Court factions formed around her, each seeking influence over the young king. But the deeper tragedy was that Charles himself never truly escaped the role of a dependent, first on his mother, then on the advisors who surrounded him like guards around a fragile relic. Foreign policy under Charles was a series of concessions. Spain, once the dominant force in Europe, found itself ceding territories, signing treaties from a position of weakness. The empire's far-flung colonies remained a source of wealth, but even that silver from the New World could not mask the decay at the heart of the monarchy. Charles signed documents, but it was others who dictated the terms. This weakness only emboldened rival powers. France's Louis XIV, the Sun King, eyed Spain's decline with predatory patience. In diplomatic meetings, France pressed for marriages and alliances that would ultimately position the Bourbons to inherit the Spanish crown. The irony was thick centuries of inbreeding to keep the crown in Habsburg hands, only for it to slip away through the same marital politics that had created Charles in the first place. At home, the court grew into a viper's nest of intrigue. Superstition and politics became indistinguishable. Whispers of witchcraft were used as weapons to discredit opponents, while prophecies and omens were treated as state matters. Charles himself, often ill and in pain, leaned into these beliefs, consulting astrologers and holy men in search of guidance. It was easier to imagine himself bewitched than to confront the slow, humiliating truth of his body's decline. One of the most famous episodes came when Charles reportedly ordered an investigation into whether he had been cursed at birth. The inquiry conducted by the Inquisition concluded that dark forces had indeed targeted him, citing the presence of spells and the works of the devil in his misfortunes. It was a verdict that did nothing to heal his body but fed the public's appetite for a king who was more ghost story than statesman. This blend of fatalism and superstition seeped into governance. Decisions about war taxation and diplomacy were delayed or derailed by rituals meant to clear the king's path or lift the enchantment. Ministers wasted precious time debating omens instead of policy. Meanwhile, Spain's enemies advanced their own agendas, knowing the king's court was distracted by shadows. Yet, not all in the palace were blind to reality. A few physicians and scholars suspected that Charles's problems were hereditary. They could see the signs not as the devil's work, but as the consequence of generations of close kin marriage. However, in a court where accusing the dynasty was akin to treason, such ideas were whispered only in private, and even then with fear. The king's health crises became public spectacles. Whenever Charles was bedridden, which was often, masses were held in his name, relics were paraded through Madrid, and the faithful gathered in candlelit vigils outside the palace. Sometimes he would recover enough to appear at a window, pale and wavering, prompting cheers from the crowd. These brief rallies only deepened the myth of his bewitchment, each survival treated as a miracle. In truth, Charles's recoveries were temporary at best. Each illness left him weaker. His legs lost strength, his vision dimmed, and his voice grew thin. Diplomatic visitors recorded with unease how the king seemed to fade before their eyes during audiences, as if the effort of sitting upright was almost too much. Behind closed doors, servants had to help him bathe, dress, and sometimes even eat. As the new century approached, the inevitability of his death without an heir became the central political crisis of Europe. Every court from London to Vienna was already negotiating what would happen when the last Spanish Habsburg died. Yes, Charles, meanwhile, lived in a strange twilight, part ruler, part relic, and wholly a prisoner of history. His reign was no longer about governance. It was about waiting for the end. By 1698, the political vultures had moved from circling to openly tearing at the carcass of Spain's empire. The question of succession dominated every conversation in the palace. Should the crown go to a Bourbon, aligning Spain with France, or to an Austrian Habsburg, keeping the dynasty's name alive in some form? Charles was pressured relentlessly to choose an heir, even as his body and mind faltered. The decision was not merely political, it was personal torment. Charles understood that naming an heir meant admitting the dynasty's failure, that his own life's purpose to continue the Habsburg line had ended in defeat. In private moments, he wept over the idea that centuries of power and tradition would end with him. But in public, he played the part expected of him, clinging to whatever dignity remained. Maria Anna of Neuburg, his second wife, became an active participant in the succession intrigue. She favored the Austrian Habsburg claim, knowing it would protect her position. Her opponents in court worked tirelessly to undermine her influence, feeding Charles doubts and fears. Letters were intercepted, alliances broken, and gifts of gold and promises of power flowed through secret channels. Outside the palace, the people of Madrid were weary. The economy struggled, prices rose, and the endless rumors about the king's health bred anxiety. For many commoners, the question of succession was distant. What mattered was survival. Bread riots erupted in the streets, and the king's absence from public life only deepened the sense that the monarchy was slipping into irrelevance. In his final years, Charles became increasingly reclusive. His days were filled with prayer ritual and the Council of Confessors. He seemed less interested in ruling and more in preparing his soul for the afterlife. Visitors described a man who looked more monk than monarch. His body wrapped in heavy robes, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes distant. The end began in earnest in October 1700, when Charles suffered a series of violent seizures. His speech slurred and his breathing grew labored. Physicians were summoned, but their treatments, bleeding, purging, and more dubious tonics only worsened his condition. The palace smelled of sickness and incense, the air heavy with the knowledge that the reign was nearly over. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II died at the age of 38. The announcement sent ripples across Europe. In Spain, church bells tolled, black banners were hung, and processions of mourners wound through the capital. But beyond the grief lay uncertainty, for his death marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg line, and with it the beginning of a continental struggle for his throne. The autopsy that followed was both a medical and political event. Conducted under strict supervision, it revealed the full extent of Charles's physical ruin. His body was emaciated, his chest cavity filled with fluid, his heart shrunken and blackened, his intestines gangrenous, and his skull swollen with water. The report concluded bluntly it was a miracle he had lived as long as he did. To the superstitious, these findings were proof of a curse. To the politically savvy, they were a condemnation of Habsburg policy. And to historians centuries later, they were undeniable evidence of the genetic toll exacted by generations of inbreeding. The bewitchment had been no spell at all, just the slow, inevitable collapse of a bloodline that had ignored the limits of nature. In death, Charles II became larger than life. His reign was remembered less for laws passed or battles fought, and more as a cautionary tale. He was the king who ruled an empire but could not save it, the monarch whose crown was both a symbol of power and a shackle forged by his ancestors. His life and death would shape the politics of Europe for decades, even centuries to come. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted almost immediately after Charles's death. France and Austria, along with their allies, plunged Europe into over a decade of bloodshed, each side claiming legitimacy to Spain's vast empire. The war was fought in fields and cities far from Madrid, but its cause lay squarely in the royal chambers of the Escorial, in the body of a king who could not produce an heir. For the people of Spain, the war brought no glory. Armies marched across their lands, harvests were seized, and taxes climbed higher than ever. Towns once loyal to the crown began to question its worth, especially as foreign troops, some claiming to be liberators, committed their own acts of plunder. In this way, the shadow of Charles II's frailty stretched long beyond his grave. The Bourbon victory ultimately placed Philip V, grandson of Louis XIV, on the Spanish throne. It was the first time in centuries that Spain had been ruled by someone outside the Habsburg name. The change was celebrated by some as a new beginning, but for others, it was the final insult, proof that the sacrifice of the Habsburgs' pure blood had been for nothing. In the years that followed, Charles' memory became both a curiosity and a warning. Scholars debated whether he had been a victim of superstition, politics, or biology. Clerics sometimes invoked his reign as a moral lesson about pride and divine punishment. Physicians used his case to illustrate the dangers of hereditary weakness. In the countryside, his legend took on a different shape. Tales grew of a king who had been born with the shadow of the devil, or marked by witches before his first breath. These stories, embroidered with each retelling, blurred history into folklore. Children were warned not to mock the sick, lest they invite the curse of the bewitched king upon themselves. For the Habsburgs, who remained in Austria and other territories, Charles' fate was a sensitive topic. Official portraits often depicted him in a more flattering light, but the truth could not be erased. In the family's own records, his reign was noted in a tone of regret, as though acknowledging a storm they could neither control nor entirely deny. Modern science has only deepened the fascination. Genetic studies on the Habsburg dynasty have shown that Charles's inbreeding coefficient was higher than that of the child of two siblings. This unprecedented genetic concentration explained his physical deformities, infertility, and chronic illnesses, confirming what some of his contemporaries had quietly suspected: but never dared to speak. And yet, there is something profoundly human in Charles's story. Beneath the layers of politics, superstition, and medical tragedy was a man born into a role he could never escape. He did not choose his parents, his crown, or the burden of being the last of his line. In that sense, he was less a ruler than a prisoner of history of blood and of the ambitions of those who came before him. The marble corridors of the Escorial still echo faintly with his legacy. Tourists wander past his tomb, unaware that behind the stone lies a man whose life reshaped Europe. His story is not told in grand statues or triumphant paintings, but in the cautionary pages of history, where power, pride, and the refusal to adapt lead not to glory but to collapse. 4 centuries on the lessons remain. Dynasties that ignore the limits of nature, nations that cling to outdated systems, and leaders who believe themselves untouchable all risk the same fate. Charles II of Spain may have been called the Bewitched, but the real enchantment was the illusion of invincibility that gripped his family for generations, an illusion that shattered with his final breath. In the quiet years after the war, historians began piecing together the full narrative of Charles II's life. They scoured diplomatic letters, medical notes, and court gossip to reconstruct a portrait that was far more complex than the caricature of a cursed king. What emerged was a man shaped as much by the political machinery around him as by the deformities of his body. The records painted a vivid contrast. A king draped in gold-threaded robes, seated beneath the towering canopy of his throne, yet unable to stand unaided for more than a few minutes. Foreign envoys often left their audiences in discomfort, unsure whether they had met a sovereign or a fragile relic preserved by ritual. Court life in Charles's time became a study in denial. Every illness was hidden behind layers of ceremony, every weakness explained away by superstition or divine will. Ministers would carry on with banquets and formal dances, even as the king lay feverish in his chambers, the music echoing through the walls like a cruel reminder of the life he could never fully join. Despite his frailty, Charles occasionally surprised those around him. There were moments when his mind cut sharply through the fog, when he questioned an advisor's loyalty or expressed concern for his people's suffering. These flashes of awareness hinted at the ruler he might have been had his body and bloodline not betrayed him from birth. But such moments were fleeting. For every day of clarity there were weeks lost to illness, treatments, and prayers. The palace became a revolving door of healers, priests, and alchemists, each promising a cure, each leaving the king weaker than before. By the final years, even hope had become a rare commodity in the royal chambers. His death closed the book on 2 centuries of Spanish Habsburg rule, but the consequences of his life rippled outward for decades. The Bourbon dynasty that replaced him would face its own challenges, yet it never repeated the extreme inbreeding that had doomed Charles. His reign served as a grim reminder that even the mightiest empires are not immune to self-destruction. For modern Spain, Charles II remains a figure both tragic and symbolic. Museums display his portraits alongside clinical discussions of his condition, a blend of art and science that strips away the myths while preserving the humanity. To some, he is a victim of his time. To others, the inevitable result of centuries of arrogance. In academic circles, the bewitched king is now cited in genetics textbooks as a case study in the dangers of closed bloodlines. His name, once a whisper of scandal, is now a lesson for students learning how history and biology can intertwine to shape the fate of nations. Yet outside the lecture halls, the legend still breathes. In quiet villages, old tales persist of a king who was born under an ill star, who saw spirits in his fever dreams, and whose soul wandered the palace long after his body was laid to rest. These stories, embroidered over centuries, keep alive the aura of mystery that science can never fully erase. And so the story of Charles II ends where it began, caught between history and myth, science and superstition. He was the last of his line, the final echo of a dynasty that tried to cheat time, and paid the price in blood. In his life, we see the rise and fall of empires, the fragility of human ambition, and the simple truth that no crown, no matter how gilded, can protect its wearer from the weight of their own inheritance.